The huge skies and the vast open fields above the Somme village of Courcelette was where Canada's Anvil of Sacrifice took place in 1916. In this 50th episode of The Old Front Line, the talk is of tanks and teenage Tommies, and once more, the forgotten Somme. Thanks for joining me on this 50th episode of The Old Front Line. Wow, 50 episodes, it's quite incredible to think that we've come this far. It's nearly a year since I started the podcast now, and I began it thinking that hopefully some people would be interested in the ramblings of a battlefield guide with, at that point, no battlefields to go and see except in his mind. But I'm staggered, really, and humbled by the huge number of people that now listen to the Old Frontline podcast. By the time we get to the end of our first year, we'll be close on, I think, 200,000 downloads, which is really quite amazing. And I really do want to thank you all for your support in listening and downloading and commenting on Twitter and Facebook. And for those of you too who support the podcasts either via Patreon or Buy Me a Coffee, it's really helped move things forward and also helped me plan for the future. And when I look to the future, obviously we're going to continue to do this on a regular basis. And hopefully, sometime later this year, it will be possible to get back to the battlefields of the Great War and record some more episodes, as I managed to do with a fleeting glimpse out there last July, actually on the grounds itself, which I think gives a bit more depth to it, and also revisit some of the places that we've visited on previous podcasts and talk to some people on the ground as well. It'll be great, for example, when the Commonwealth War Graves Commission interns return to the battlefields and have a chance to talk to them, and also to talk to those who work and live on the battlefields as well, and hopefully during the course of making those episodes out on the grounds, meet some of you and meet some of the people who visit and discover why they go to the Western Front and what it means to them. So there's lots of episodes planned. We've still got a huge amount of the battlefields of the Great War to yet to visit in these podcasts. So we're not going to run out of subjects or ideas, and we've dipped in and out of history rather than just straight battlefields as well, which we'll continue to do. And one of the things that I hope to explore once we again can get out onto the battlefields is to produce some visual versions of some of these podcasts, video podcasts, I suppose, to get out on the ground, film it, talk about it, and so we can actually see what it is I'm talking about. I suspect they won't be as regular as these podcasts, but nevertheless, it will be a bit of an addition to it. So that's one of the plans going forward for the Old Front Line. I started the podcast really because, over these years of visiting, particularly the battlefields of the Western Front, I've realised that I've been lucky in so many ways to spend time with veterans of the Great War, as I did in the 80s and 90s, and interview them. But also, all that time living out there, it's a very different experience to just visiting it. You get to know the landscape, you get to connect to the landscape in a different way, and you get to know people on that landscape and the stories that they can tell. And I realise that in some respects, by doing what I've done over so many decades, to a small degree, you become part of the history of those places yourself. And I wanted to have an avenue really to explore that, explain about it, talk about it. And the podcast has given me that, and I hope you found some of those stories of interest, and I'm sure there will be more to come. Many of you too, I think, will be listening to these podcasts and have yet to actually visit any of these battlefields, and I hope that it might have inspired you to do that. The connection that you can have with these places once you've been there, once you've stood in cemeteries like Tyncott and seen that endless splash of white stone across the hillside, or walked the lanes of the Somme and seen the sun set over the Thiepval Memorial, or found your way through the thick dark forest of the Verdun battlefields, or climbed those hills in the Vosges. It's a place that, in some respects, no amount of words will ever do justice to, and it's a place that, once you've been to, I think will stay with you forevermore. And the stories that connect you to it through the men and the women that were there, and the history not just of the soldiers but of the families of those men and how it affected them, the way the echoes of the Great War went on beyond the battlefield. I think that's all part of its power. And I see that power, that connection, in the way people talk about the Great War on things like social media and some of the online talks that I've attended during the course of these recent lockdowns. It's good to see it. It's good to see it not just amongst those like myself who've been going for many years, but a younger generation of people who are just as inspired, just as connected to this. And that torch of remembrance and connection to the Great War, I think, really is in safe hands. So as we celebrate this 50th episode of the Old Front Line podcast, thanks again to you all. Thanks for joining me here. And here's to the time that we can return to these places ourselves and walk along that old front line. For this 50th episode of the Old Front Line, I've brought us back to home territory for me, home ground, the village of Courcelette, where I lived for many years on the Somme battlefields and where my daughter Poppy still lives. It's a place that will always remain special, unique to me in so many ways. And we've walked a part of it before when we went from the village across to Courcelette Cemetery in a previous podcast. And if you go back through the podcast lists on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, you'll find it there. And I'll put a link on the podcast website for it as well, oldfrontline.co.uk. But this walk, we're going to look at the grounds in the approach to the village and then walk past Courcelette Cemetery and up onto the high ground beyond the village where Regina Trench ran, and look at the closing stages of the Battle of the Somme there, involving the men of the Canadian Corps and the last battle there at Desire Trench on the 18th of November. But where we're starting is on the road between the village of Pozières, roughly in the middle of the 1916 battlefields, astride the Albert-Bapaume Road, that Roman road that runs right through the middle of where the fighting took place on the Somme front. The road between Pozières and Courcelette is a minor road, and we've walked down it from the village of Pozières, and we're standing at a point where a little track goes off to our left across the fields, out towards a position known to the Australians as the elbow, close to what was called the OG lines, the old German lines, two thick German lines of defence that ran across this part of the Pozières Ridge. This was the ground where essentially the Australians handed over to the Canadians in early September 1916, the Australians having been fighting here for well over 6 weeks, and in those 6 weeks had suffered almost as many casualties here at Pozières that they had at Gallipoli in 1915. 23,000 men of the Australian Imperial Force were killed, wounded or missing at Pozières. It had been a costly battle for them, and a battle in which they'd learned a lot about war on the Western Front and what it was about compared to their experience in the Dardanelles the year before. So the Australians handed over to the Canadians, and these were men of the newly formed Canadian Corps, then 4 Canadian divisions, so about 80,000 plus men in total, probably closer to 90,000 when you think of all the support troops that would have been part of that corps. They were commanded by a British general at this stage, Lieutenant General Sir Julian Byng, not Arthur Currie, as many Canadians believe. He would become Corps Commander later on in the conflicts. At this stage, he was a divisional commander within the Corps. And the Canadian units had been fighting on the Western Front since the end of 1914. The very first one to go into action was the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, who arrived on the Western Fronts in that winter of 1914-15. The bulk of the main Canadian Expeditionary Force, the units of the Canadian Army, formed into a force to be sent out to the battlefields of the Western Fronts, didn't arrive until February of 1915, but in time for the Second Battle of Ypres, which was Canada's first engagement on the Western Front, a battle that in just one period saw more than 2,000 Canadian soldiers killed and well over 4,000 wounded, gassed or taken prisoner. So the involvement of Canada on the Western Front and the experience of Canadian soldiers was very much at the forefront of some of the key battles of that conflict from that early stage of 1915. And when we look at the Canadians that fought in that early period of the war, from the Second Battle of Ypres right through to the fighting here at Courcelette and Regina Trench, these men were all volunteers. There was no conscription in Canada at this stage of the war. These men had all voluntarily enlisted. A very small percentage of them were actually Canadian-born. The majority were born outside of Canada. In the original Canadian Expeditionary Force, something like 70% of the men were born in Great Britain. But when you look at an average Canadian nominal roll for a battalion that fought here on the Somme, you see men from literally all over the world, including many European countries, some that are sometimes surprising, like Russia and Belgium and Denmark, Sweden and the Netherlands. It was really a multinational force, unlike almost any other army on the Western Front. Sure, Australian and New Zealand soldiers were drawn from quite a diverse group of people from different nations, but not in quite the same way or in the same numbers as you see with men of the Canadian Expeditionary Force. After the Second Battle of Ypres, Canadians had taken part in the fighting at Festubert and Givenchy, but otherwise most of the next year or so of their experience revolved around service in the Ypres salient in Flanders, where they took part in minor operations like the Battle of the Saint-Éloi craters, but otherwise just held the line in quite a wide front, from the Menin Road around Hooge and Sanctuary Wood, where there was a battle in June of 1916 involving the men of the newly arrived 3rd Canadian Division. But otherwise they just held the line. When you read memoirs of men from that period, the Journal of Private Fraser, and I'll put a link to that on the Old Frontline website, it's an excellent memoir of the First World War, one of the best Canadian ones. He's down on the Kemmel fronts opposite the Messines Ridge for a big chunk of the period before the Battle of the Somme, and describes it in some detail. He sees the detritus of the early battles there. It's a quiet sector, but they lose men from the day-to-day activities of trench warfare. So while the Canadians have been involved in battle, mainly defensive battles, the thing about Courcelette and the attack here on the 15th of September 1916 as part of the Battle of Flers-Courcelette is that this is the first time that Canadians go into action to capture and essentially liberate ground in the Great War, and certainly the first time in the 20th century that Canadians would liberate a part of France, something that, of course, would echo on into the next World War as well. And their reputation as a tough, hardened, almost elite fighting force, which many modern Canadians often refer to, is something that at this stage of the conflict was yet to be achieved. They had a good reputation for what had taken place at the earlier battles in which they'd been involved, but the Somme would be the point in which Canada and the Canadian forces would really learn what trench warfare was and what could be achieved. And commanders like Byng, who commanded the entire corps, and divisional commanders like Currie would essentially win their spurs in battles, in the hard-fought battles here on the Somme at Courcelette and Regina Trench, and put those lessons learnt into action again for operations like Vimy and Hill 70 the following year. So we're standing here on the road that leads from Pozières down towards Courcelette, with the track going off to our left. What do we see from where we're standing? Over to our right is the Australian Memorial to the 2nd Australian Division on the site of the Pozières windmill. There's the big radio mast there, close to where the Tank Corps Memorial is located, more obviously of the tanks fairly shortly. The windmill site is the highest point on the 1916 battlefields, but even from where we're standing here, we can have a fantastic view across this northern part of the Somme battlefield. If we follow the line of the pylons across the fields, that takes us up to the village of Gomecourt at the very north of the Somme battlefields. And with a pair of field glasses, we can see villages like Serres and Beaumont-Hamel and Thiapval. We can see the huge archway of the Lutchen Steepval Memorial on the skyline as well. So we've got an incredible view from here, and we can see why both sides were keen to possess high ground like this, the Germans to defend it and hold it, and the British and Empire troops, including the Canadians, and before them the Australians, to wrestle that from the Germans and push the line forward. So where we're standing is pretty much on the front line of the 15th of September 1916, and what had led to the point at which the Canadians would move in to make this attack as part of this operation, the Battle of Flers-Courcelette, was the fighting in the village of Pozières, captured by the Australians. They'd then pushed through and tried to take Mouquet Farm, Ferme de Mouquet, Mucky Farm or Moucow Farm across on the left flank. In the middle, this area around the Pozières windmill, the OG lines and the elbow. But it had been difficult to push the Germans back here and had cost, as we mentioned earlier, the Australians dearly. But these were the positions handed over, and the Canadian objective in this battle was to advance across the ground before us into the village of Courcelette, follow the line of the Albert-Bapaume road to where there was a large sugar refinery, the sugar factory at Courcelette, and then get to the Courcelette-Miramont road, push beyond to the high ground above the village, and then link up with forces that would be advancing across what was known as the Ancre Heights from the direction of Thiepval. This was the general idea, to push the line steadily forward, break through the systematic lines of German defence, and break through on the Somme front, grinding down gradually the German army. The attack made on the front where we're standing now was led by the men of the 2nd Canadian Division. Over to our far left, where Mouquet Farm is located, the men of the Canadian Mounted Rifles made their attack there. But to the left of us, towards that position known as the elbow, were the 27th and 28th Battalions, and to our right was the 21st Battalion of the Canadian Expeditionary Force. The 27th and the 28th would advance down onto the village. The 21st would follow the line of the Roman road and advance and take the sugar factory, the sugar refinery in Courcelette, and they would be assisted in their advance by tanks from the heavy section of the machine gun corps as it was then. Eventually that would become the tank corps. This was the first time that tanks had been used in history, not just military history, and these tanks that had been developed the previous year, been brought across to France, trained with Canadian units and other British units prior to this attack, would here play quite a major role in the capture, particularly in the position around the sugar refinery. And I suspect it's probably one of the reasons why the Tank Corps Memorial was located on this battlefield at Courcelette rather than Flers, which is a village often more associated with the first use of tanks. We're going to return to the subject of tanks in their first ever use, probably in a special episode further down the line, but here they would assist the Canadian infantry in moving across this ground. One of the differences with this attack compared to what had taken place on the Somme just over 2 months before, on the first day of the Battle of the Somme, was the more intelligent use really of artillery. The 1st of July was a bit like a sledgehammer, drop a huge amount of artillery and hope that no one would survive. And what you see in battles like Courcelette is the use of an increasing amount of heavy artillery to smash and destroy key targets, to keep the Germans down in their positions while the infantry advanced with the use of standard field artillery and howitzers, and the implementation of guns of all calibers. When you walk this ground here at Courcelette, you find everything from 13-pounders from the raw horse artillery that was supporting the Canadians right through to the super heavy shells, but you find French 75s as well, not from the fighting in this area in 1914, but there were French batteries allocated to the Canadians to drop French 75 shrapnel down onto the German wire and more effectively cut it. And the infantry here advanced in wave formation, leapfrogging almost through positions. So again we see the increasing development of infantry tactics, not just send lines of men forward with their rifle at the port. You're using infantry in a more intelligent way, protected by their artillery and now connected to the use of tanks as well. All of this still in its infancy, but gradually what we describe as an all-arms battle gradually coming together to achieve victory. The front line here is taken, the sugar factory is assaulted, and with the assistance of tanks that's cleared, and the infantry push through there to the sunken lane just beyond Courcelette village. As the assaulting units get to the outskirts of Courcelette itself, the 22nd Canadian Battalion arrive, leapfrog through them, and they are the ones symbolically given the task of clearing Courcelette village. Well, why symbolically? Well, the 22nd Battalion were the Vendus. They were the French Canadians. This is the first French village that Canadian soldiers will capture in the Great War, and so it was seen as symbolic for that to be achieved by French Canadians. And the French Canadians went through the village, cleared all the houses, cleared all the cellars, and when you read some of the war diary accounts, you see reference to the use of P-bombs being implemented for this task, and these were phosphorus hand grenades that were thrown down into the close confines of dugouts or cellars, and no one would come out of there alive. The number of prisoners taken in the clearing of the village was apparently quite minimal. Again, I think this is all part of the symbolism. They've come to rid France of the German occupier, and the French Canadians are leading the way in that. By the end of the 15th of September 1916, by that evening, The Canadians had captured the village, they'd taken the sugar factory, they'd pushed beyond, and a front line now ran from the northwest of the village, round the top end of the village in a little valley, across to the sunken lane on the Miramont Road, and linking up to friendly forces close by in the village of Martinpuy, close to the Roman road, the Albert Bapaume Road. So this was a successful Canadian attack. And we'll walk now following this road down into the village. As we do so, there are parts of it where there's quite high banks, and once the village was actually taken, and the fighting then moved on to Regina Trench and eventually Desire Trench, the casualties being evacuated from the battlefields down into the dressing station in the village would then be brought down this road en route back towards the casualty clearing stations near Albert, and there were casualty reception points and ambulance points along this road where the wagons that would evacuate the wounded were awaiting to receive the wounded coming back from the front line and take them down the repaired Roman road back towards safety, back towards hopeful recovery and treatment in the casualty clearing stations. But we'll follow it down past these high banks. The road curves and then goes on a sharp bend to the edge of the village, and we'll stop there and we'll look at the village from that point. Standing here on this bend, we're looking down into the village of Courcelette. There's a few modern houses on this side of the village which weren't here when I moved here in the mid-1990s. The first old brick house that you can see up ahead on the left where the barns are, that's where I used to live, and that was on the spots of a house that had existed there before the war, a small farm surrounded by an orchard, and where the modern houses are now, that's where the orchard was before the war, and the stumps of it were certainly still there when the Canadians came down into this village on the 15th of September 1916. But of course by the end of the Great War, and indeed by the end of the Battle of the Somme, there was very little left of villages like Courcelette. They were destroyed first by British and Canadian guns, and then of course eventually, once the Canadians had taken this ground, by German artillery, and with fighting here again both in March and in the summer of 1918 as the Germans broke through and retook this ground, and then as the British retook it again in the final battles of the Somme. Courcelette was really just dust, and in talking to some of the older generations of people that lived in Courcelette in the 90s whose parents returned here after the war, it was a very primitive life to come back to. Most didn't return until early 1919, and they lived in some of the cellars of the houses or scrounged Nissen huts and army huts from some of the camps in the area. Eventually some provisional housing was put in, and there's still a bit of example of that in Courcelette on the far end of the village. But generally they lived really quite primitively, and while a few houses were rebuilt in 1921-22, the bulk of the village of Courcelette wasn't rebuilt until the summer of 1923. So it was close on 4 years for many of these people to be living in those sort of conditions. Villages like this that were destroyed in the war were awarded the Croix de Guerre by the French nation, and you'll often see the symbol of the Croix de Guerre on the town hall, the village hall, in the places where this occurred. And there was a physical medal as well, and the medal is retained in the Mairie in the village hall. And on certain days of the year when we lived here, this medal would come out. The mayor had it obviously in safe keeping and would bring it out quite proudly and be very, very proud of the fact that this is one of the Croix de Guerre villages of France. The same thing was done again in the Second War in places like Normandy, where villages were just wiped off the map in the fighting there in 1944. And those villages were awarded a Croix de Guerre under the same sort of circumstances. But here across this region of northern France and eastern France, it's very, very common indeed. The other factor with villages like this is that only a proportion of the original population returned. People had fled, often in two different directions. Some had gone off to the east and ended up in places behind the German lines and probably had not had a very good experience in that. Others had gone west, and the mayor of this village, Monsieur Gons, for example, had gone to his seaside villa at Le Tréport on the French coast and spent the war there. But when you look at the archives, and recently, thanks to someone on Twitter, I was put on to the fact that essentially the census records of these villages exist in the French online archives for the Department of the Somme. Taking a sort of an average figure of people that lived in Courcelette before the war, only about half the number of the population returned in the post-war world, and I think this was typical of many places in this part of northern France. But living here in Courcelette, living on the battlefields, was a very different experience to just visiting this ground on an occasional basis. The war was, even then, ever present. Farmers would turn up something almost every week during the ploughing season. People would knock on the door and say, "I found this. What is it? Is it dangerous?" That was quite a common experience. And when you walk the grounds around the village at certain times of the year, in February they would do a lot of banking work and cut down trees and scrape away sections of bank. Bits of the past, fragments of the Great War would emerge from the ground. At one time, a little tiny fragment of a pipe, a clay pipe, came out of one of the banks in the village with a beautifully carved harp on it. And, was that Canadian soldier of Irish descent who had brought that with him, and even still had tobacco in the bowl. It was quite extraordinary, really. So the Great War is always there, and this, of course, also extends to the recovery and discovery of human remains on the battlefield. This was something that I experienced in this village on several occasions, one of which was identified and reburied in Courcelette Cemetery, and we spoke about his story in a previous podcast. But I suppose living and sleeping and just existing in the space that had once been the Great War, the battlefields of the Great War, really, I suppose, deepened that connection to these places. And just going out every day and doing normal stuff, but passing by and seeing the ground and watching how the ground changed and seeing it in different times of the year, it just gave you a totally different perspective on it in many ways. And when I read books that say the Somme was flat, then I just think back to the ground as I've walked it and seen it over the years. So it's always really, whether you visit or whether you end up living here, it's always the best way to get out and understand these battlefields, to see it with your own eyes, with your own boots, get out there and walk the grounds and just see how the terrain, how the landscape really is an essential part of the understanding of the war. And today, of course, is all part of that last witness of the Great War in the way it keeps on giving us a connection to the past through simple things like the discovery of a pipe with tobacco in carried by a soldier in 1916, through to the incredible sort of archaeology that goes on different parts of the Western Front. But there were other things living here that I really began to appreciate or understand and have respect, even more respect, for the generation of the Great War. And that was in terms of weather. I've been out walking in these fields when the clouds have opened and you're in this vast, open, exposed landscape with no protection and you get soaked to the skin. And, I had modern walking gear, so it wasn't really that unpleasant. These guys didn't have that, and you think of things like that. You think of men standing in these trenches, and I interviewed veterans who would say they stood there and for hour after relentless hour was the ping of rain on the top of their steel helmets. You think of things like that, and one winter here, the first winter that we lived here, it dropped to nearly minus 25, which is very much mirroring the conditions on the Somme in that cold winter. And believe me, that was cold. But again, we're living in a modern world, and these men were living in open ditches in fields. So I think it really is incredible when you think that men lived and survived and sometimes fought in the myriad of weather conditions that were here. And even the hot weather, could be just as bad. If you were out on the battlefield, cut off in a shell hole, your water bottle would soon run dry and you'd have a terrible thirst. When you read the accounts of men wounded out in no man's land, this is something that often crops up. So the weather is important, and I find myself actually, when I look at battles of the Great War now, looking more and more into what the weather conditions were like when those operations were taking place. But we'll leave the weather and the village behind now, and we'll continue not into the village itself, but we'll turn off to the left on this bend and take a minor road that'll take us up to Courcelette British Cemetery, which we can see across the fields. Before we get to Courcelette British Cemetery, we'll pause on the approach to it. And those of you that follow me on Twitter and have done for quite some time will know that this is the cemetery that I've photographed the most over the years, obviously from the time in which I lived here, but also because in many respects, from certainly photographing it, it's a unique cemetery in the way that it sits on a rise with a track leading up to it, and for a big chunk of the year the sun sets at different angles behind it, and in these vast open landscapes with the huge skies you can get some incredible photographs, particularly in some of that amazingly diverse weather that you see in this part of northern France. It's a place that I never tire of photographing, whether it's in the height of summer with the chiff-chaffs singing in the trees of the cemetery, or whether it's in the depths of winter. A couple of years ago with some of my Great War battlefield friends, Tim Thurlow and Mark Allen, we were able to spend a day walking this ground in the deep snow and seeing it under those sort of conditions, something that I'd not seen since the 1990s when it was like that. And it changes your perspective of these battlefields and the landscape that's here. But for me, photographing this cemetery from this point, it's almost become for me a way to symbolise the eternity of all of these beacons of the Great War, these cemeteries, these silent cities across these battlefields. With this little pathway, the pathway of life leading to the cemetery, is quite symbolic in that respect. And with the sky and the sun setting or rising behind it, it's created for me at least a unique little corner of the Somme battlefields. And it's nice to see people going there too and taking their own photographs of it. More and more of these are now cropping up on social media, and it's great to see them. But we'll follow that path now up to the cemetery itself. It's surrounded by trees that, given their size and age, were the ones that were planted here in the 1920s. And I think the trees really do add something to this location. They make the cemetery really part of the wider landscape, part of the wildlife of that wider landscape, which I think is an important part of what these silent cities are about. As we come up the steps past the shelter on our right, we come into the original Plot 1 of the cemetery. And it wasn't started by the Canadians. The cemetery was started here in the winter of 1916-17 when the front line was beyond Regina Trench up towards a position known as Boom Ravine in the approaches to the village of Miramont and near to Grandcourt. And British units that occupied that line during that winter buried their dead here on a reverse slope away from the battlefield, a safer place to bury their dead comrades. Then the cemetery was chosen as a main concentration cemetery for this area, and a wider area of burials were moved into it. Canadian burials from the village of Courcelette itself. There were several cemeteries in Courcelette, one next to the Red Chateau, which was the main dressing station in the village for Canadian troops, and another one I think close to the church as well. And those cemeteries were closed and moved into here. So most of the men that are buried in here from the Canadian Expeditionary Force attack in this area are from the early phase, so from the 15th September through to the latter end of September, the capture of the village and the push beyond. The fighting at Regina Trench and beyond that area is represented in the next cemetery that we'll go to at Regina Trench itself. So there are 780 Canadians buried here, 657 British, 514 Australians, and the bulk of those are from the area around Ferme de Mouquet Farm, and one New Zealander. 1,177 of these are unknown, so that's over half the total. But many of them, as you wander along, are identified as an unknown Australian soldier or as an unknown Canadian soldier. So it's very much got an Australian-Canadian feel to it. And in 1998, they added an additional burial to the cemetery, which was Russell Bazisto. He was an Australian soldier killed in the fighting at the Pozieres windmill, found by a local farmer, identified by his large aluminium dog tag, his identity disc, that he was still wearing. His family was contacted, still living in the same place that he'd come from, and they came out with members of the Australian Defence Force and the military attaché, and Russell Bazisto was reburied here alongside some of the comrades that he fought with in the Great War. So again, the history of the Great War continues here. That last page of its story will never ever be turned in places like Courcelette and right across the wider parts of the Great War battlefields. From the cemetery you can look back into Courcelette village, and beyond it you can see the site of the sugar refinery, the sugar factory. When I come up here, I often think of one of the veterans that I interviewed. I only interviewed one Canadian veteran of the Great War, and that was a chap called Lance Catamol. He wasn't born in Canada, he was born in Britain, and he'd emigrated there just before the war with his elder brothers. And many of them had gone to Canada to seek their fame and fortune. There were these popular stories and novels of, young men going to Canada to go gold panning, for example, and finding gold nuggets as big as their head. But when they went out there, many of these men struggled to find anything that was the size of a pinhead, and so had not perhaps done quite as well as they thought they might. So you might have been able to afford to get out to Canada, but to get back again was a different prospect. How could you afford to do it? Then the war comes along. So some men, like Lance Cattermole and his brothers, took this as an opportunity to join the army, do their bit, and possibly take their discharge back in Britain and get home. So Lance and his brothers join up. Now, Lance is underage. He's only 15 when he tries to join up. But he lies about his age and he becomes one of those thousands of teenage Tommies. And he does his training with the Reserve Battalion in Canada and then is posted to the 21st Battalion Canadian Expeditionary Force on the Western Front. He served with them for a while on the positions in Flanders between Saint-Éloi and the Messines Ridge, and then moved down with the battalion to take part in the Battle of the Somme. And when he went into action on the 15th of September 1916, he was only 16 years old. And this was about to be his introduction as to how cruel and awful war could be. Lance was an interesting veteran. He wouldn't let me record him. He would say that you'll read about my experiences one day, and he was true to his word that when he eventually passed away, a little package came, and it was a typescript section of his memoirs in which he described the attack on the sugar refinery and the capture of a German sugar trench by him and his comrades. Here he witnessed the order that had been given, the unofficial order that had been given to Canadian troops that day of no prisoners being put into action. As men came out of the dugouts with their hands up, the Germans were shot down. And this terrible and awful incident that he witnessed as a 16-year-old stayed with him, of course, for the rest of his life, haunted him for the rest of his life, and made him reluctant to be recorded, to talk about anything but the funny stories of the Great War until he was gone. And his confession, if you like, his part in it all, was laid out in his memoirs, which his family very kindly agreed to let me use in my book on Courcelette, published by Pen and Sword, and I'll put a link to that on the Old Frontline website. After the attack at Courcelette, Lance wrote home to his mother, who had no idea that he was in France, and knew, of course, that he was underage, and she wrote to the Canadian government and told them they wouldn't discharge him, but they took him back to the Canadian depot, which was then at Seaford in Sussex, and later he was at Kent with the depot there. And until he became 18, this is where he would remain. And he became 18 in the early summer of 1918, 2 years later, when he was selected for a draft to go out as a reinforcement draft to the Canadian soldiers who were then fighting in the Second Battle of the Somme in the breakout from Amiens on the 8th of August. The casualties, of course, in that period of the war were very, very high, and the survival rates of drafts like this were often very short. Before he was sent out, he was interviewed by the depot commander, and when he was marched in, he was surprised to find that this commander, who he'd not seen, was an officer from his old battalion, who remembered him. Cattermole was quite an unusual name after all, and it obviously had stuck in this officer's memory. He looked up at him and he said, "Cattermole, don't I know you?" And he replied, "Yes, sir, I fought with you in the Battle of the Somme." So he looked at him and he said, "You've done your bit, Cattermole." And he signed a chit, and Lance never went out with a draft. And he put his survival of the Great War down to that moment where that officer decided not to send him back out onto the battlefields where so many thousands of Canadians were being killed and wounded, and perhaps Lance's story would have been a very different one. He went on to become a commercial artist after the war. He designed railway posters for a number of railway companies, particularly in the southern part of England, and he was commissioned to paint the uniforms of the Indian Army, and that collection is now in the National Army Museum in London. In the Second World War, he was living in Worthing in Sussex, and he became an officer in the Home Guard, and he painted these incredible portraits of the men in his unit, which again are in the collection of the National Army Museum. Lance was a kind and gentle, creative man who had seen the very worst of war, the worst in many respects of aspects of the 20th century, and rather than be diminished by it, he went on to continue to find beauty in the world. And I was very lucky to have an opportunity to talk to men like him who had seen those things, witnessed so much on those battlefields of the Great War. And when I sit here in cemeteries like Courcelette, with just the birds in the trees and the wind passing across the open fields here, I like to think that aside from those who will remain evermore in these silent cities, the echoes of the men who fought here and survived and went home are somehow here too. So we'll leave the cemetery now, we'll go left and continue up the track, and we'll walk up to the next high point where there's a junction of tracks just beyond the cemetery. On this next part of the walk, as we come away from where Courcelette British Cemetery is located, the ground rises and we can see across to our right there's a long area of high ground, a ridgeline. And where we are now is the junction, the approach to the junction of two sets of German trenches. To the right of the track was what was called Zollengraben Trench, and that linked into an area known as Regina Trench on the British maps, which we'll come to further on in the walk. And this bit of ground as we walk along here, and it's open and exposed, there's no woodland here, and there wasn't at the time of the Great War. Ahead of us increasingly we'll see the archway of the Thiepval Memorial and the tops of the buildings and the trees around Mouquet Farm. Over to our left is the Pozières Ridge and Pozières Village. But to the right of the track here, near to Zollengraben, is where one of the several Victoria Crosses awarded to men of the Canadian Expeditionary Force, where that action took place. And this involved Private John Chipman Kerr of the 49th Battalion, Chip Kerr as he was known. He was a bayonet man who was part of a bombing team bombing their way up the Zollengraben on the 15th of September 1916. And as he came into this part of the trench, he outflanked the Germans, and making them think that they were surrounded, he took 62 of them prisoner in a stretch of about 250 yards of trench. He'd already lost a finger in the fighting earlier on in the attack, but he carried on, and for his bravery and the capture of this position and all those prisoners, he was subsequently awarded the Victoria Cross. He was born in Canada, so he was not one of that large percentage of men who came from outside of Canada, and he worked as a lumberjack in Nova Scotia before the war. He returned home a hero, survived the Great War, and was awarded an incredible $700 in gold by Edmonton, which was an absolute fortune at the time. Like many men who were awarded the Victoria Cross, his post-war life was not perhaps quite so glorious, and many men found it difficult to readjust to civilian life after an experience like the Great War. He died in 1963, aged 67, and in the 1970s his widow donated his Victoria Cross and other medals to the Canadian War Museum. Continuing along the track, we come to that crossroads of tracks further up. And again, we can see the exposed nature of the ground here. We're going to turn right and continue along the next stretch of track that takes us across towards Regina Trench Cemetery. And we're now on that high ridge line above the village of Courcelette, which is now down to our right. Ahead of us in the distance, which we can't quite see, is the Ancre Valley with Miramont and Grandcourt in it. And to our left is where Regina Trench was located. This was a long German trench that emanated from near Thiepval and ran across on the reverse slope of this ridge, across from our left to our right, over beyond the village of Courcelette towards Les Sars. It is stated to have been one of the longest, if not the longest, single German trench on the Western Front, and it was certainly built in a formidable location. It was a deep and wide trench with thick belts of wire, but I think the exposed nature of the ground here and the fact that it was so cleverly sited that when any units would approach it, they would be skylined and therefore perfect targets for the defenders. This is what caused the Canadian assaults in this area to stumble and fall against it, really, because in that quick, decisive battle of the 15th September with the capture of the village, that was a great success. But it took weeks and weeks of fighting to clear the ground here at Regina Trench, with an attack in force on the 1st of October, another one a week later on the 8th. And here in this unsuccessful fighting, Canadian unit after Canadian unit was thrown against Regina Trench with heavy losses. One of the problems was that the forward observers for the artillery supporting these infantry attacks couldn't see the trench, couldn't see the defences, and the artillery was largely ineffective in these early attacks. On the 21st of October 1916, the 4th Canadian Division, which had now moved down to the Somme to take part in the fighting here, launched an attack and got into the trench. The artillery was more successful in that battle, but still parts of it remained in German hands until the 10th, 11th of November, when it was finally cleared, with British units in several of these attacks advancing on the left flank of the Canadians in this area. As we carry on along this track, it eventually meets another crossroads of tracks. To our right, it would take us down into the village of Courcelette. Again, this was part of the evacuation route of wounded away from the battlefield area down into the village, the dressing station in the chateau, and then by ambulance down the lane where we walked before, back towards Albert and the casualty clearing stations. But to our left, that takes us down towards Regina Trench Cemetery, our next stop. As you come into Regina Trench Cemetery through the main gates, you can see a little plaque on the gates with the maple leaf symbol of Canada, and these were placed on selected sites on Great War cemeteries across the battlefields of the Western Front to mark some of the key cemeteries connected to the Canadian experience of the Great War. And here at Courcelette, both Regina Trench Cemetery, where we are now, and Adanac Cemetery, that we visited in another podcast, both have these plaques, as do many others. And you can use them to sort of follow, really, the key battlefields in which the Canadians fought between 1915 and the end of the war. As we walk into the cemetery, there are two shelters left and right of where we're standing, and the cross of sacrifice ahead of us. Beyond that, the neat, almost continuous rows of graves heading off to the far side of the cemetery. And Regina Trench itself, named after Regina in Saskatchewan, ran on the far corner of the cemetery. The original plot of graves here was made either in a part of it or very close to it in shell holes of men killed in the October fighting for this area, and then subsequently the cemetery was enlarged after the war to bring in the British casualties between here and Thiepval, and then the Canadian casualties in the wider area around Courcelette itself. So there's 1,667 British casualties buried here, 563 Canadian, 35 Australian and 1 American. We'll come to him in a minute. Of these, 1,077 are unknown, so quite a high proportion of it. And when you wander along the rows here, again, you see a large number of unknown soldiers, many of them saying an unknown Canadian soldier of the Great War. So it is, again, very much a Canadian cemetery linking to the fighting here in 1916. The American who's buried here is Lieutenant Irvin Shaw, who was an American pilot in the Royal Air Force. He was shot down near Courcelette on the 9th of July 1918, aged 24. His Sergeant Observer is buried with him, and this is the reason why his grave was not subsequently moved to another cemetery, because they were essentially buried together and there was no way to separate the remains. Normally, as an American, he could have been moved to the American Somme Cemetery at Boney, or repatriated back to the United States, but it wasn't possible. So he's one of a number of American servicemen buried in Commonwealth cemeteries with a particular style of grave that indicates that he's an American rather than a British or Commonwealth casualty. It's one of the loneliest cemeteries on the Somme in many ways, because it really is out in the wilds, away from the main areas that visitors go to when they come to the Somme battlefields. And it takes quite a trek to get here, to drive up that minor road from the village of Courcelette and then walk the final distance down the track. So you tend to get some of the more hardier visitors to the battlefields coming out here. But nevertheless, looking at the visitors' books, it does get quite a few visitors during the course of the year, many of them increasingly from Canada, which is a good thing. Coming back to the main gate and walking out onto the path, following it back to the track and then turning right, the ground drops down a little way here into a valley. And again, we're very close to Regina Trench running across to our left. There's a new plantation of woodland ahead of us to our left that was made around about 2000 and has now grown up into quite a sizable area of woodland, which was not there at the time of 1916. This was an exposed open landscape, as we've said several times in this podcast. But ahead of us, on the other side of this gully, was a trench known as Desire Trench, and this is where, in this area, the Battle of the Somme came to an end on the 18th of November 1916 in the attack on that position by units of the 4th Canadian Division and British units across on the left. Snow fell that day. It was a bit of a snow blizzard in some places, and really that made the fighting pretty much impossible. And although Desire Trench was captured, it was not without some loss. This brought effectively the Battle of the Somme and the Canadian involvement in the Battle of the Somme in this area to a conclusion, a battle which had cost the Canadians over 24,000 casualties since the assault on Courcelette village just over 2 months before, and of these, some 8,000 were killed in action or had died of wounds, and of those fatal casualties, more than 6,000 were missing. They had no known grave, and their names would be eventually added to the Vimy Memorial, which we discussed in the podcast just a few weeks ago. In some ways, Courcelette and Regina Trench are some of the more forgotten battlefields of the Great War for Canada, but yet here, those 8,000 dead represent 12% of Canada's total dead for the Great War, And this was one of the most deadliest battlefields, single battlefields of the Great War for Canada, with all those casualties, in particular that incredibly high number of missing soldiers in a battlefield that's only a couple of miles across. But it's a battle and a battlefield overshadowed by events at Vimy the following year, in the terrible conditions of Passchendaele, and then of course in the great victorious battles that the Canadians took part in the advance from Amiens through to the final shots at Mons in 1918. But yet this is all part of Canada's story, and these places are worth remembering and visiting because of that. And following that attack on Desire Trench on the 18th of November 1916, no one sent a memo around to the lads in the front line and said, right chaps, the Battle of the Somme's over now. The fighting obviously came to a conclusion, but localised fighting continued. And of course, one of the great problems during the winter that followed was those terrible conditions on the battlefield. Sub-zero temperatures, minus 25 in the front line, lots of snow. The snow would melt, fill the trenches up full of slush and water, massive instances of trench foots. I mean, a truly awful period of the war for the men just trying to survive, let alone fight. But on the 17th of February 1917, in what was really a continuation of the Battle of the Somme, an attack took place here on the Miramont Road and Boom Ravine, a big long ravine that runs back towards the village of Miramont from where we are at the moment. And some of the casualties from that battle are buried in Regina Trench, where we've just come from. We spoke about in the last podcast the idea of a forgotten Somme, places on these battlefields that few people come to, and we mentioned that in Regina Trench with the visitors there. But I think it's important to come out to these places. Here at Courcelette and Regina Trench, out in these fields standing between Regina Trench and the location of Desire Trench, with Boom Ravine ahead of us, the Ancre Valley in the far distance, and Miramont, Grandcourt, we are probably the furthest from civilization that you'll get on any part of the Somme battlefields. Here you're alone in the landscape, surrounded by the shadows of the Great War, looking out across this ground as the men did during that harsh winter of 1916-17, in conditions that we can only really but imagine. But it's here, I think, that you walk and connect to the Great War in a different way, away from the trappings of the modern world, beneath that vast open sky. In the summer, the swallows darting and cutting through the breeze, or on a crisp spring morning, the skylark singing high above. Here, somehow, it's all timeless. Here we have that chance to pause and think, muse upon what draws us back time and time again to these battlefields, what makes us return, as we do, to the old front line. You've been listening to an episode of The Old Front Line with me, military historian Paul Reed. You can follow me on Twitter at Sommecorps. You can follow the podcast at Old Frontline Pod. Check out the website at oldfrontline.co.uk, where you'll find lots of podcast extras and photographs and links to books that are mentioned in the podcast. And if you feel like supporting us, you can go to our Patreon page, patreon.com/oldfrontline, or support us on Buy Me a Coffee at buymeacoffee.com/oldfrontline. Links to all of these are on our website. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you again soon.